Welcome to The Authority File, the academic library podcast from Choice. This episode is made possible with help from Rowman and Littlefield. I'm Bill Mickey, the host of the podcast and editorial director for Choice, and we're very pleased to welcome Bobby Newman and Bonnie T. Harina to the program. Bobby and Bonnie are the editors of Protecting Patron Privacy, a LIDA guide, a book recently published by Rowman and Littlefield. Bobby is currently a community engagement and outreach specialist at the National Network of Libraries of Medicine at the University of Iowa, where she helps public libraries meet the health information needs of their communities. She's involved in national library initiatives, including past service on the NISO committee to develop a consensus framework to support patron privacy in digital library and information systems, and an advisory committee for the Pew Internet and American Life Project, which did research on libraries in the digital age. Bonnie is a librarian, entrepreneur, and library community convener, most notably perhaps as the founder of the Electronic Resources and Library Conference. She is currently a researcher at the Data and Society Institute, a New York City think tank focused on the social, cultural, and ethical impact of technological development. In that role, Bonnie represents libraries among academics, civic technologies, legal experts, policymakers, and entrepreneurs. In this third episode of our four-part series on patron privacy, we discuss the ethical considerations libraries must face when they begin to formalize their missions around patron privacy. In the final episode, which we'll release next week, we'll get into the practical side of privacy, how libraries can actually implement their own procedures and policies. Okay, so the library's role in protecting privacy comes out of, supporting intellectual freedom within the library. And as you note in the book, that freedom, the research, discovery, and sharing of knowledge and ideas is compromised if people feel like they're being watched. Again, there's different kinds of data, and personal data, as we've discussed, comes into play here, and as it does in that story about the patron's tax information that was recorded in the copy machine, social media activities, and it basically personal data that's not necessarily tied to intellectual pursuits. And I guess my question is, where and how does a patron's own responsibility figure into that equation? I guess this is a question about what are libraries responsible for, and what is the patron responsible for, and do those responsibilities differ?
Yeah, so I think it's a little. I don't think it's appropriate to put the responsibility back on the patron at this point in the privacy technology situation. If protecting your own privacy was as easy as closing your drapes, then yeah, I think that probably, okay, maybe I'd buy into that. But I think that given the history of libraries and the dedication to privacy that we've seen, and our role in technology and digital literacy, that we obviously have more resources and a better understanding of a lot of these things than the average patron. Some of that is just basic. Some of the things that we can do are just so basic. For example, having data tracking on our services be opt-in instead of opt-out. Have the default be that they have to agree to collect that data, versus that the vendors automatically have access to it. And that was something we went back and forth on this committee that we've talked about. I think the other thing is that patrons and libraries, there's different reasons to collect different data, right? So obviously we have to keep track of who has a book while it's checked out. But after it's been returned, we don't have any reason to keep track of which individual had that book out. We don't have a good reason. And there are probably people who would argue that with me, and I don't care. But patrons sometimes want to keep track of what they checked out, right? We know anybody who's worked in a public library or even an academic library knows they'll come back and like, oh, I read this book and it had a blue cover and there's a teapot on it. Like, I cannot remember what it was. And so some of the new options that we have in our new systems allow patrons to opt in to track their reading history for that reason, because they want to keep track, whether they want to just keep track of how many books they read this year, if they want to go back and try to remember what that book was so they can recommend it to a friend. They have all kinds of reasons for opting into that. But I can almost guarantee you that no one is opting into that for the sole purpose to allow a vendor to collect data on them. But that's what happens when they do that, right? And so, when we talk about this, and one of I think our role is to try to work to make sure that we're ensuring the privacy of our patrons, and then the decisions they make don't get used against them, either in a nefarious way or in a way that, say, maybe they wouldn't approve of. And nobody reads those fine print terms, right? I mean, like every time I update my iPhone, I'm like, whatever, click,
I do the same thing.
And that's another part of the problem, that it's so complicated and there's so much legalese, and that they can't just say, we're going to use this data to track you and we're going to try to sell you products or, that kind of thing. So I think until we see a real shift in how privacy works in the United States, that the burden does fall on libraries and librarians.
And now, a quick pause to pay the bills. Our guests this week, Bobby Newman and Bonnie Tijerina, appear courtesy of Rowman and Littlefield. Rapid changes to technology have made library privacy more important than ever, yet increasingly difficult to ensure. Library patrons deserve to know that their personal information is safe, and library staff need to know how to best navigate this continually shifting field. Newman and Tijerina's new book, Protecting Patron Privacy, a Lita Guide, offers librarians guidance on data collection and use, privacy laws and regulations, use of in-house and internet tools like social networking sites, and much more. Protecting Patron Privacy and many other books about privacy are available from Rowman and Littlefield. If you're purchasing the book from Rowman.com, that's ROWMAN.com, use the promo code PPP30 to save 30% off the cover price. So, and you kind of touched on this, but there does seem to be maybe a slight catch-22 here where, some of the technology that you're talking about has created opportunities that libraries can use to enhance their own services, but in some ways might undercut their ability to uphold their promise to protect patron privacy. I mean, is this, where a library might opt to, use this technology to keep track of, the various ways patrons are engaging with library services. Is that data perhaps something that just stays, obviously stays internal, or do libraries need to make decisions on even that kind of approach to data?
Well, I think unfortunately that most of the tools that would allow you to do that type of analysis are not internal tools, but belong to corporations who also then get access to that same data.
Right.
And this is probably, I don't know what Bonnie's opinion is on this, but I would say no. Okay. That you shouldn't be using it. I understand that people feel like libraries are competing with corporations, for-profit corporations like bookstores or Google, and that we have to embrace some of this capitalistic technology in order to compete. But our values and our core goals are so different that if we would just stick to those, I think that we need to stick to those instead of running off to get the latest product from X vendor that's going to let us analyze our country, our county, and who has library cards and when the last time they were here and what the demographics of the area where they live is. And I think Bonnie can probably talk more about the nefarious ways that data could be used. So I'll stop talking.
Well, so to answer your question. I do think that libraries need to be asking themselves a lot of questions when they're working with vendors and when they're using tools that are not kept in-house. And so Bobby had mentioned earlier about a project that I'm working on, a grant-funded project through IMLS with Michael Zimmer, who's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and we're specifically looking at this issue. So we are in this catch-22 kind of space where there's tools available externally. There's also a number of libraries working on in-house tools. that are not necessarily relying on outside vendors. Those are, of course, bigger libraries or libraries that have the budget to be able to actually construct things in-house. But what we want to do is what we feel like, at least at this moment, that there isn't a good understanding by decision makers and leaders in our profession to know to fully kind of think through all the questions that we may want to be asking of these vendors or even of these in-house tools that we're bringing, especially in terms of privacy, but even beyond that, just sort of how we sort of bake in our values either in the tools we build or in the questions we ask when we're negotiating with third parties. So one of the outputs of our project is to actually create these sort of field guides to help decision makers. Let's say, for instance, if they're talking with a cloud computing organization or a digital content vendor, and they're trying to decide, whether to go with them or not, to sort of help them with specific questions. Because I do think there's sort of a set of audits or questions that could be asked to determine if a vendor is how they're holding on to data, or if the tool's being built internally, what is the security around certain data? How long do you actually need, what are you actually going to use it for, and how long do you actually need to keep it, if you need to keep it at all? I think being able to ask a series of questions can help an organization decide if they do want to work with third party, or they do want to build a tool internally to help them utilize data, but actually be able to make it with their values, top of mind, and some of the more important, to really kind of focus on that as an important part of the decision making.
Right. I mean, because I guess some of some of this technology that libraries might incorporate to, keep track of their own services or engagement with patrons, do help with their ability to sort of take an evidence-based approach to the success or failure of some of those services, as well as, I suppose, going back to an institution's administration and saying, here's what's working, here's what's not. That same data could influence budgetary decisions. So, I guess there's that end of it too, where this type of technology could enable a library to do certain things for itself. But as you say, Bonnie, I mean, I think the approach probably should be that they make sure that the privacy implications or their values and intentions around privacy are baked into that those decisions around what technology to build or buy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big advocate in believing that that the one thing that really differentiates libraries from any type of company or organization that we would consider to be our competitors is our values. And so in a lot of ways, I can't imagine making these decisions about companies to work with and data to collect and without considering questions that maybe your competitor is not considering. And just, like what Bobby said, I think some people would disagree that in fact we are just trying to play catch up with for-profit companies or other organizations that are seen as competitors. But I just ultimately think that the reality is that this is what really makes us unique. And in fact, being at Data and Society, where I work almost exclusively with non-librarians, it is those values that is why people are looking right now to libraries to help them solve some of these problems, because it's not like, oh, this is like a Google, but a physical building. It's because we come with this history of how we manage information and how we think about the power of information and the power of knowledge, and then how that's embedded in our values. That's actually what is our competitive advantage and our separation from anybody else we think is our competitors. That's why for me, I think it's just critical to be thinking about how we engage with vendors, with technology, to ensure that.
I think it's really important in the age of big data to remember that not everything that's important can be measured. How do you put a value on our core ethics or the right to privacy? What's the dollar about that when you're talking about justifying the budget? You can't measure those things, and they're incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. Do you suppose these issues, particularly with ethics and the value statements, do they apply to any library type? I mean, are there issues specific to public libraries versus academic or even K through 12?
I mean, I do think there are specific needs and specific issues. So obviously, the whole point of having many library branches and having different types of libraries is because they're all working for their communities, and communities are diverse. So obviously, right, the needs are going to be different, and maybe even a bit of the mission is going to be different in these different types of libraries. I think, and maybe this has just come from my work with Office of Information Technology Policy, is I often don't just think about libraries. I think about librarians, like individuals, and what our role should be. So for me, some of this is beyond just what a library should do. It's sort of questions that we as people engaged in this profession, that these are things we need to be thinking about, too, and bringing that to the table when we are working with vendors or we're thinking about making changes in terms of technology in our libraries. So, so I do think there are differences, but I do think there's some core things around our values that is more about what the profession feels than necessarily the specific type of community.
The only thing I would add is that obviously there are different regulations for data for minors.
Oh, true. Yep. And where does that come into play specifically? I mean, is that something that obviously K through 12 or public libraries might need to pay attention to more than an academic setting?
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. Okay. You just heard from Bobby Newman and Bonnie Tijerina. Bobby is Community Engagement and Outreach Specialist at the National Network of Libraries of Medicine at the University of Iowa, and Bonnie is a researcher at the Data and Society Institute, a New York City think tank. This concludes episode 3 of our 4-part series discussing digital privacy in libraries and the recent book out from Rowman and Littlefield, edited by Bobby and Bonnie, called Protecting Patron Privacy, a Lita Guide. This episode was brought to you by Rowman and Littlefield and Choice. Be sure to join us for episode 4, where we talk about some of the ways libraries can actually implement comprehensive privacy plans and procedures.
I think having a policy, on privacy and that kind of thing is a good start. I mean, it might seem obvious, but it puts all of the library staff and probably the board on the same page.
You can search for and listen to all the episodes of the Authority File podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, or find us on the Choice website at choice360.org. Just click on the librarianship dropdown. If you listen to us on iTunes or Stitcher, be sure to give us a review. We hope you like what you hear. In the meantime, you can find out more about Choice Reviews and get updates on the latest podcast episodes on the Choice Reviews Facebook page or on Twitter at Choice_Reviews. Search for or comment on the podcast using #TheAuthorityFile. Thanks for joining us today.